Hello and welcome to NARUC'S Center for Partnership and Innovation's webinar series. This is Dominic Libertor, Logistics and Finance Officer for CPI. Today's webinar will be covering how commissions coordinate with their partners during energy emergencies. Before we introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, what is NARUC? We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1889. Our members are the regulatory commissions in all 50 states and territories. Additionally, we have FERC and FCC commissioners who are also members, and we have associate members in over 20 countries. Our member agencies regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. Second, what is CPI? We are a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members. We identify emerging challenges and provide expertise and strategies in our core topical areas. Please take a look at our topical areas in the chart. I encourage you to check out our website for previous webinars, papers, and trainings at www.naruc.org/CPI. Just a few webinar logistics. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be posted on our webpage. If you do have questions, please use the chat box to send us your questions at any time in the webinar. Our panelists will be responding to audience questions throughout the moderated Q&A following our case studies. For this webinar, I will now hand it off to Commissioner Balasbas. Jay Balasbas was appointed to the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission in February 2017. Happy anniversary, Jay. He currently serves as the chair of the Subcommittee on Pipeline Safety. He's the co-chair of the Committee on Critical Infrastructure and is a member of the Committee on Gas for NARUC. Jay will talk about the NSET mini guide featured in this webinar and introduce our panelists. Jay, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dominic, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. I want to especially thank the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation for hosting today's webinar. Before I introduce our two great speakers this afternoon, I want to make a quick mention of the National Council on Electricity Policy's mini guide on state agency coordination during energy-related emergencies. This guide is available on NARUC's website and is a great short read about how public utility commissions, how they coordinate and how they work with their state energy offices and offices of emergency management. One of the things about the guide that I think is very useful is it gives a good overview of three different general models of how public utility commissions are working with the emergency support functions. You have the first model where the Public Utility Commission is the main emergency support function 12 coordinator. The second model, which is my home state of Washington, is closest to where we are a supporting actor with our state energy office and our Office of Emergency Management. And the third model that the guide covers is where the PUC will share roughly equal responsibility with the Energy Office or the Office of Emergency Management. So today, like I said, we've got two great speakers who we're going to hear two different case studies from, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. And we have some questions while they're going along in their presentation, and I encourage you all to ask questions as we go along and in the chat box, as Dominic mentioned. So our first speaker we have is Lisa Gorsuch. Lisa is the Emergency Preparedness Manager at the Oregon Public Utility Commission. She has worked at the Commission for 20 years and, as you can see on the slide here, has served as an energy expert, senior staff advisor to the Commission, working on a variety of things, including rates, policy, rulemakings, legislative issues, and others. Lisa was a senior enforcement agent on a multi-jurisdictional organized crime task force prior to her work at the PUC, and was also a firefighter and paramedic before joining the organized crime task force. And our second speaker we have today is Megan Levy, who is the local energy programs manager and energy assurance coordinator at the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation. Megan has spent more than a decade working with building energy efficiency, with low-income weatherization, and with the Wisconsin State Energy Office, with a new name now, the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation. Megan currently oversees the Energy Independent Communities Program with more than 147 communities as members. And Megan designed and is the manager of the Municipal Energy Efficiency Technical Assistance Program, or METAP, that's a great acronym there, where the Energy Office provides expertise to municipalities, tribes, and schools across the state of Wisconsin for energy efficiency projects. And Megan has served on the board of directors of the Midwest Renewable Energy Association back in 2016 and 2017. So Lisa, I'm going to turn this over to you to provide an overview of a case study of a winter storm in Oregon from 2019, which we also experienced here in Washington State as well. And I will have you take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Commissioner Balasbas. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate on this panel today, and I hope I can provide some helpful insight with regard to Emergency Support Function, or ESF 12. As Commissioner just stated, I'll give a brief overview of a winter storm that, by certain standards, particularly where you're located across the country, might not seem that dramatic when you're used to getting massive amounts of snow on a fairly regular basis through the winter. However, the storm that impacted us in the Northwest, it was late February of 2019, it began on February 23rd. We had a significant amount of first rain and then very heavy snow that impacted the southern half of the state from about, I would say, 100 miles, not quite even 100, 60 miles south of our capital city of Salem, all the way down to the California border. And what was really challenging with this storm, it was like the four riders of the apocalypse. It just went from bad to worse. This storm caused 100 old-growth trees to fall, taking, of course, down power lines and blocking roads. We had the city of Oak Ridge actually cut off completely, no way in, no way out, a town of approximately, I believe, 3,200 people. We had a train, an Amtrak train, due to downed trees, actually get stuck in Oak Ridge and not at a platform or anything. So we had 183 people trapped on a train in a town, which, by the way, was cut off and had no electricity. So we had major infrastructure issues in terms of outages. Of course, when your electricity goes out, you're going to lose communications shortly after. And, you know, the snow kept coming. In Oregon, we have, I'm going to bore you with some statistics quickly and explain why. We regulate fully 3 investor-owned utilities here in Oregon: Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, and Idaho Power. But then we also have very limited safety regulation over 38 consumer-owned utilities that are 20 cooperatives, 6 people's utility district, and 12 municipalities. So we had one IOU that was impacted in this winter storm and had over 30,000 customers out. The rest of the impacted customers were customers of cooperatives, PUDs, and municipalities. There are some challenges in supporting them, and we do support them in Oregon when they have any type of emergency. We want to be there in the same capacity as the ESF 12 partner as we would be for our IOUs. However, we don't have the same connections with them, regular interactions. Some of these providers are very small operations, and communication with them can become a big challenge when they're faced with a storm of the magnitude that we had in February. And one issue was Douglas County Cooperative actually lost 75% of its infrastructure as a result of this storm. So keeping track of how many customers are out, how long they're going to be out, to communicate with our Office of Emergency Management here in Oregon and figure out what the needs of the communities are going to be, to work with our other emergency support function partners, other state agencies, because we did have multiple counties declaring disaster areas as a result of this storm. So it's important, and I believe that everybody knows this, I may be stating the obvious, but in an emergency like this, you know, who could expect that, you know, many things cause power outages, many events, but you don't know what's going to happen in terms of losing roads, communications, all of this at once. And if you're a bit of a one-man band, as many people, you know, counterparts that I communicate with in other states are, it's incredibly important that you have established relationships with, you know, critical partners. ODOT and I were pretty much, and that's Oregon Department of Transportation, joined at the hip. For a significant period of time, we actually had 100 miles of Interstate 5 closed due to low-hanging lines that were weighed down by snow, and then multiple other highways that were blocked off for various reasons. I needed to know who to call in the middle of the night on, you know, or in the wee hours of the morning on a Sunday, because I had calls begging for help due to first responders losing all communications. We had lost cell towers, and we had access issues getting up to generators to put fuel in them to keep them going while we worked on restoring electricity. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make connections, know your critical partners ahead of time. In Oregon, the way we're structured, the PUC is responsible for ESF 12 energy and natural gas. We do work through the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. However, we have full responsibility for electric and natural gas. And then we have Oregon Department of Energy that is responsible for the fuel plan, liquid fuels. They take all of that. So we share responsibility, but have very separate duties, and we don't cross over. However, we work closely together because it's going to be rare, depending on the type of emergency you have, that you're not going to possibly need fuel, and Department of Energy is going to be our connection for that. And then being able to get the crews down the road, you need to know who your ODOT connections are, or your particular Department of Transportation. So while ESF 12 is specifically energy related, it's important to not have tunnel vision and know how much, and not to make us more important than we are, but energy is critical for every other ESF partner. Mass care is going to need energy to take care of people. You know, ODOT can't clear roads without having crews helping them clear live wires off of lines. You know, I just can't emphasize how important it is to know all of your partners and not be meeting them or trying to figure out who to call when you're faced with a mission assignment from your Office of Emergency Management, or however you're structured. So with regard to challenges with response when you have utility partners that are COUs rather than IOUs and how they differ, we're very lucky in Oregon. While we have many, as I said, consumer-owned, 38 of them, since I've been in this position, have been out trying to meet as many of the emergency management or just management period for these different utility providers, letting them know that while I'm from the commission, I'm not looking to infringe or regulate them, letting them know that I'm available, at the state level in the event of an emergency to provide what I would to an IOU. And it's been wonderful. I mean, they were a little leery at first, and now the relationships that I've forged have really helped, not only for me to provide assistance to them, but for me to be able to get up-to-date information on outages and be able to inform everybody at the state level and be able to plan for shelters, that sort of thing. In terms of challenges, you've got to figure out who you can call during an emergency. And if you're dealing with a really small cooperative or people's utility district, understanding how they get information out to the communities they serve as far as their outages and restoration times is very important, because you may be using that same, be it Facebook, Twitter, their website to be updated, because I don't want to call a critical person for updates when they have a serious job to do to deal with their damaged infrastructure and getting people restored. And these relationships are not required by statute here in Oregon. It's a relationship that you work at, and with turnover, you've got to be diligent and stay on top of it and know when there's turnover and update phone lists, and the face-to-face meetings are critical. Meeting someone by phone or email is better than nothing, but I truly believe any opportunity you get where you can go to a meeting and meet many of them at once and shake their hand and let them know what you can do for them, it's so valuable. And the Office of Emergency Management in Oregon that we are structured under, and what that is by statute, the Oregon Office of Emergency Management has 18 ESF or Emergency Support Function partners, and at the county, the local county level, each county has an emergency manager. If there's a situation that has gone beyond their control where they need state assistance, they will, in fact, contact the Office of Emergency Management, and based on their needs, there will be mission assignments that are sent out to the different ESF partners. And so in Oregon, we are responsible, as I mentioned before, we are actually Emergency Support Function 2 communications, and Emergency Support Function 12 for natural gas and electricity, which gets pretty tricky to take care of all of that at once. But we get our mission assignments through OEM. There is one difference for, outages that happen on a fairly regular basis due to wind and different weather events in the winter, or wildfires in the summer. We do have incidents where we are actually feeding information to the Office of Emergency Management, providing updates to them where it hasn't gotten to the point of the Office of Emergency Management needing to activate their Emergency Coordination Center, but we have outages, we let them know how many people are out, how it's being addressed, and keep them updated and, you know, go from there. So I believe I've painted the picture. We actually, if you've had a chance to review the mini guide, and if you haven't, I hope that you will take the time to do that. Oregon does seem to fall under Model 3 perhaps the most, but it's difficult. I can see where we actually are kind of a 1-3, but mostly under Model 3. But I would be happy at the end of this to answer any questions that you might have. And at this point, I will go ahead and turn the floor over to my esteemed colleague, Megan Levy.
All right, thanks very much, Lisa. And great presentation. I'm sure we can get into, if there's questions, you know, please feel free to stop me. Otherwise, I'm sure we can get into some discussions later. So Wisconsin, I'd like to talk about our July 29 windstorm, which was really, it was a derecho combined with tornadoes. And it was a pretty significant event anywhere. And I think it sounds like the Oregon storm too, even though we get a lot of snow in the upper Midwest, when it starts as rain, that's just really hard to deal with. So, and I used to live in Portland for a while, and I have to say that you don't have the infrastructure, so it's really, really difficult to deal with snow. This storm, you know, we saw it coming. We're good at weather prediction these days, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can deal with 100-mile-per-hour winds. Impacts to infrastructure along the order of, as we tallied it all up, we had about 300,000 customers. We have 5 major IOUs in the state, so 300,000 customers of IOUs, tens of thousands of municipal and cooperative customers were out too. We have about 100 municipal utilities and 28 co-ops. The IOUs and municipal utilities are regulated by the Public Service Commission. We should back up and say the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation is located at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. So we're sort of a twofer. So we've got the SEO, State Energy Office, you know, just like Oregon, where we have a special fuel plan. It is dedicated to liquid and unregulated fuels. But sitting here at the Public Service Commission, we have a lot of synergies with our chief engineer, who is quoted in the mini guide, but retired this year. So new job for me to make sure I'm training up the new chief engineer and we're coordinating well. But our Office of Emergency Management also has a great relationship with the utilities in terms of, we have a public-private partnership that emergency management and utilities share information, share as much as they can, really, in terms of plans, in terms of exercises and planning. We've really fostered that relationship. I think Lisa touched on this a lot, and it's so true. Talking to your utilities, talking to stakeholders, critical infrastructure, it makes all the difference. And if it is in statute, like I believe our colleague from Virginia, who was going to be here, would have had a little more to say about, hey, this is statutorily mandated, this is what we do. In Oregon and Wisconsin, I think it's very similar. We don't love a mandate, turns out. We like to have a little more informal, but heavily relationship-based, where we know each other and we know the phone numbers and we pass along. We also try to brief up as much as possible. That's a big thing, just to make sure folks have a piece of paper that has an energy emergency operations guide. All hazards are covered in that: electric, natural gas, fuel, any kind of shortage in the energy sector, which really touches every piece of infrastructure you can think about. So back to these July 2019 windstorms, the impacts to infrastructure were incredibly severe. We had 500,000 feet of conductors, over 700 poles, 700 cross arms, and nearly 600 transformers required replacement. And this was across, we had 18 counties and 2 tribal nations who qualified for the presidentially declared disaster that came shortly after this. And the state did provide support. We did provide a lot of National Guard support because we had about 250,000 acres of trees blown down. And you can see some of the devastation in this picture on the screen here. It was unprecedented in the state, and it really came across a very forest-rich and agriculturally rich part of the state. So we had our energy efficiency program directly after this, the Focus on Energy. It's been around for almost 20 years. They went ahead and did an emergency barn roof replacement program. Hey, we can build it back better. We had a lot of questions, though, about things that we really hadn't had to face before. Typically, we had highway departments out there, we had DOT, everybody's out there cutting up trees. But then you have your supper club and your business, and there's always this line between what government does to make sure normal life can resume, and then taking business away from the private sector. That's never what we want to do. The National Guard doesn't come in and restore your business or home. That's a different process. So we had a lot of interesting logistical challenges. So as I mentioned, we're Model 3. Everybody's sort of equal. But if we go to the next slide, I think there's a little map of the areas. And I'll just point out this red area is where we had that 250,000 acres of trees blown down. But where all state government and all the coordination is happening is down there in that dark green area, Madison, marginal risk. We had nothing. I was blissfully ignorant of a lot of what was going on up north, and because some of the areas up there can get really remote, there's a lot of lakes you can't see. Some folks we didn't know were as severely impacted as they were because of communication outages, and again, Lisa mentioned something similar to this, where you've got big rural areas. So the State Emergency Operations Center was not stood up until late on Sunday night, after this came through on Friday afternoon. So, but it did go on for 2 days, and we had massive rain amounts that came with this too. Flash flooding in the western side of the state that's just below that red area, which took out roads, which had disastrous effects on water and wastewater utilities. So on that Monday morning, after the State Emergency Operations Center was set up, I was walking my dogs, and I got a call from my friend in emergency management saying, what's going on? I've got electric utility line trucks waiting at the border with Iowa, and they say they can't come in because the governor's executive order doesn't include a provision for them. And I'm going, huh? The what? So we realized the vulnerability there, in which we have these plans out there, but we only had one contact listed for DOT who could verbally waive a really silly sort of interstate excise tax. But these guys were just sticking to the books, and they wanted to come help, but they were waylaid for almost 4 hours before we could get the right person on the phone and waive that. And it's not even a waiver, it's just sort of a delaying this tax. You don't need to weigh in here, you don't need to, it's something about fuel equity across different states. And part of that is we had a fairly new governor who just wanted to get an emergency declaration out there so that we could authorize the National Guard, which is fairly commonplace to do. Unfortunately, we had just lost a longtime lawyer at the Wisconsin Department of Emergency Management who was the guru who had written our Chapter 323 on, written all that statute enabling emergency management, and she knew everything like the back of her hand. So it was a good reminder. Thankfully, no one died because of that. We were able to get the crews out there. We did have people who were out of power for a week. So it was a great time to go back with the after action report and sit down with all the players and say, here's what we should have done better. Here's something we need to have in our back pockets in terms of a template. I have a template in my fuel plan. Nobody knew that we had a fuel shortage until about 4 or 5 days in, when we got reports that utility line trucks were having trouble finding diesel in the affected area because it was so wide and it's so rural. So that was a challenge, because there were also communication issues, and many of the utility line workers, mutual assistance folks who were coming in from 3 or 4 states away weren't going back to a central. Their calls were going to Iowa and Nebraska, and no one was telling the State Emergency Operations Center that they didn't have fuel. We actually have a concept that we stole from Oregon's plan, and I should say borrowed because they're very nice and they helped us with it. It's called fuel points of distribution. So in the very center of this red area, you see a town called Wausau. Well, that's one of our largest counties. It's Marathon County. We have 5 different county highway shops wired up with generators on site, and each one of those county highway shops has about 20,000 gallons of diesel in the ground. And we would have been more than happy. We have about 20 county highway shops across the state, but we just happen to have that conglomeration in Marathon County because they asked to do it, and we said sure. It was a grant program we had put out. And that would have been an excellent time to exercise those fuel points of distribution. Thankfully, we have some funding from the Department of Energy through the Energy Office, where Emergency Management and I are going around to every single one of our 72 counties and 11 federally recognized tribes, and we're making these relationships. We're talking about, we surveyed them, we found out about 58% of them don't have an energy emergency plan. That's okay, we've got a template. And we're going to talk to them in a no-fault environment about what's next and how to coordinate better. And in fact, because of these very storms, we'll be holding a pre-storm meeting in the Northeast and the Northwest regions, because our emergency management sort of has the state divided into 6 regions. Those were the most affected, and that's where we want to bring the utilities in. And to Lisa's previous point, it's just have folks who are on the ground explain what's going on. The emergency management has so many things that they need to understand. The electric utilities are constantly, they have a huge job, and I think sometimes it can be easy to say, well, why didn't you tell me what the restoration time was? Well, they don't know because they're cutting down trees that are on top of everything. And so to have those relationships, to have those conversations is so valuable, because we know emergency managers have to decide, this was July, so they didn't need to put up warming shelters or anything. And it wasn't too hot because of the storms and the rain, so they didn't have to put up cooling shelters. But by day 3 or 4, they were starting to put up phone charging stations and starting to, find areas where power was restored and direct vulnerable communities there. And that's the conversation that we're really trying to facilitate through a partnership from the Energy Office and Emergency Management with the support of the Public Service Commission. So I think every state is a little different, but the key thing is just coordinating together and not, and leaving your ego at the door. It's not really important whose job it is. It's important that everybody knows what their job is, where their lane is, and how to make sure that they're communicating what they're getting done. And so, the advice that I would give to others who want to enhance collaboration with ESF 12 partners is offer to do work. I bring money to the table if I can, and then I offer to help with things like updates and try to initiate things like, hey, I know we've had some turnover here. We got to get on that new cell phone list. We need to make sure we let's do a quick exercise with this X scenario. And bringing back information that I learn at national conferences. Had the opportunity to go to the NARUC'S summer policy study and sit on a panel with a guy from the California largest water utility in California, who's dealing with these power shutoffs. That is a really, really interesting quandary, because one of the first things we're trying to do is back up critical infrastructure and make sure water and wastewater are functioning when we have any kind of outage. So I think that when we can bring those stories back and talk about how to do it better and read plans from our partner states like Oregon and Virginia and read things like this mini guide, so we can kind of understand, wow, there's so many ways to do this. What's the best practice? What can I try? And keep the conversation fresh, because that's another thing I've heard in the local planning efforts is that people can get overworked and tired, because certainly it is a lot of work. I'm co-chair of the NASIO Energy Security Committee, which I should have had in my bio, but that gives me great access to so many energy offices and to hear about their different, some of them are in natural resources agencies, some of them are economic development agencies, but we all have in our federal statute a responsibility to maintain contingency plans for energy emergencies. And typically that's interpreted as fuel, because energy offices were created out of the Arab oil crisis of the 1970s. And so transportation efficiency and fuels are top of mind, but particularly when we're in the utility regulatory environment, it's a great time to coordinate, to look at those system maps, to try to understand how we can add value to energy emergency response plans. For really all hazards, because everybody needs energy. So I may just leave it there unless I've forgotten some huge glaring thing. Do I have another slide? Oh, okay, I do have another slide. Look at those trees down. Yeah, I would just say this is, I mean, again, these things are getting bigger. We don't have hurricanes in Wisconsin, but this is probably the closest thing. 14 tornadoes, 100-mile-per-hour winds, flash flooding. So I'd say if you do take one thing away from this event, it would be take away the mini guide. Read that. It talks all about collaboration between these three sort of important organizations. And then I think that the case studies we've talked about are pretty, well, tornadoes, this is certainly what we're talking about, and floods. But the wildfires, it's the same thing. It's just a different, we have to shut off the power from the wildfires. And it's incredibly dangerous. I know California is doing a lot of studying on that, but that's one of the reasons that as we look at, okay, our charge is to maintain energy emergency plans and contingencies. Well, part of that contingencies could really be to be proactive. So another part of this local energy assurance planning and resilience grant is to cite up to 10 critical infrastructure microgrids in localities around the state. We're starting with the Oneida Nation, which is just outside of Green Bay. They were hit by this storm. And they also have like a cluster of critical infrastructure that is missing one key backup generator. So it's sort of just to find where could we do a smaller version of the grid that might be cost effective and feasible. We've got a wastewater treatment facility with a big lift station that has no backup generator. Well, that's perfect. It's right by the water tower. And we're also trying to be a little innovative with this stuff. Can we use any kind of pumped water? Can we use pumping the water into the water tower when we've got a nice sunny day and then bring it down to be able to create electricity when we need it? So stay tuned on that. We'll be done with that grant in a couple of years and have some feasibility studies and have hopefully some installations and lessons learned. But I know California did a whole round of critical infrastructure microgrids back in 2018, which were leaning heavily on a lot of the public documents they have. And I think that there's, always different ways to think about responding and resilience. So just thank you so much for the opportunity to be in the conversation. And I'm interested in anybody's questions and further discussion with my colleague Lisa from Oregon.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa and Megan, for sharing those case studies. It's really interesting to hear how how your two situations have a lot of similarities, but also how you go about fostering those relationships and the responses. I want to check with Dominic here to see if we have any questions in the queue.
Yep, thank you, Jay. We do actually. This one is for Megan. Did Wisconsin seek a dyed diesel waiver form from the IRS during this fuel shortage?
We did not seek that because the fuel shortage was really, really localized. And had we had better coordination, I don't think we had to have a fuel shortage at all. It was unfortunately reported to us later that line trucks drove up to 100 miles to find diesel. And of course that limits their ability, they got to drive 100 miles to get filled up and then come back. That's really silly. So we didn't, but that is one of the waivers that we could have sought had we needed it. And one of our vulnerabilities right now is that we actually have only one refinery in the state, and it's in Superior, which is adjacent to this area that had this huge blowdown. But it had a fire in April of 2018, and it's not producing diesel at all right now. So normally about 10% of the fuel that we use in the state is coming out of Superior, and it would be diesel. But unfortunately, we didn't even have that, so that may have impacted or been the reason why some of the gas stations in the area were sort of running low. But to your point, the petroleum is a just-in-time business. That's how you make money. You don't want to have too much inventory sitting around. So we do have sort of our hours of service and our weight limit waivers at hand, although we wouldn't normally do weight limits in the summer because they just rip up the roads if you've got too much weight on them. But good question. Thank you. That's definitely something it's an arrow in our quiver, I would say.
Thank you. We did have another one come in, and this is for either of you, Lisa or Megan. You did touch on this a little bit, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on what unique methods can regulators specifically use to improve and build relationships with their ESF-12 partners?
This is Lisa. I'll jump in, and then hopefully Megan will have something to add as well, because you definitely are going to get a different perspective from a different person and what works for you. I have gone out of my way to go to conferences that I know are going to be well attended by our consumer-owned utilities, again, for that opportunity for face-to-face meeting. Even explaining to my boss, you know, what's the benefit in this? And I'm like, I'm going to get in a room with all of these people at one time versus going on a junket and having to visit each utility one at a time, which wouldn't, you know, be very cost effective or time well spent. And so I don't know how to describe it other than I am just very direct. I introduce myself. I give them a stack of my cards if it's somebody from, you know, a people's utility district or municipality or cooperative, and I'll say, I understand your feelings towards the commission and that you don't want to be regulated, and I have nothing to do with that. And I understand it because at one time that was, you know, I spent a great deal of time where rates and policy was my game. But at this point, when you just look somebody in the eye, shake their hand and say, here, give my card to anybody you feel needs it. It's got my personal cell number on it, as well as my satellite phone number and my desk phone and my work cell and everything. And I can't promise you that I'll get you what you need, but if you call me and tell me you need something, I'm going to do everything within my power, move heaven and earth to try and get it for you, because to me, you're no different than one of our investor-owned utilities in an emergency situation. I'm going to do everything I can for you. So just taking an opportunity, and I'm using far too many words, to make a short story long as only I can, take the opportunity, figure out where, you know, there's going to be a meeting or some sort of a conference where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. Go and just tell people you're there for them, and it's worked very well for me.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. Meeting people where they're already going to be, rather than creating a new event for them to go to, is really key, because most of the folks we're talking about are pretty overworked, whether it's utilities or local emergency managers or other stakeholders. The other thing I forgot to talk about is joint coordination groups for planning purposes, but it really helps people think about, you know, what they'll do. So we've got a fuel coordination group, it's public-private. We also have a fuel coordination group that's just state agencies, including the Energy Office and the Public Service Commission. We have a legal coordination group so that hopefully lawyers can duke it out before we get to a black sky day. And, you know, I would just say tabletop exercises, talking this stuff through with people whenever you can. Another thing that I do is I go to emergency manager trainings, and so I'll do a petroleum system demystifying training, and then I'll sit and I'll listen to their ops training. And I'll try to understand, you know, from their perspective, what's going on. Same with Lisa and the utilities, just going to Wisconsin Electric Cooperative Association events, because our rural electric co-ops have so few customers per line mile. They've got a lot of unique challenges. So when a blowdown like this happens across so much co-op territory, that's really impacting the ratepayer, and it's not anything that the Public Service Commission can do per se, but it's something to think about as the Energy Office and an organization that can give out grants and can think about impact on the economy and energy, and, you know, so can we build back better than rather than just putting up all these poles and cross arms and things? Is there a way we can bring in some federal dollars, and obviously we got some FEMA dollars on this too, but is there a way we can help with our expertise from the Energy Office to to aid locals and aid co-ops and municipal utilities who often don't have a huge staff and a lot of people dedicated to this stuff. They're trying to keep the lights on and do their jobs. So I think, you know, the guide talks about a lot of our different kind of approaches to this, but really sharing information, showing up, and like Lisa said, giving out your card. You know, again, a lot of this is just really like being there, having the relationship, shaking the hands, and making sure you have a plan for succession too when you're not able to be there.
This is Lisa. I wanted to jump in really quickly and also say, and well said, Megan, but I want to say I find it very valuable and critical to also know as many, and in my case, I want to know and have a face-to-face meeting with each of the county emergency managers, and that's taken some time, but I've been successful in that. That's also very critical and has helped out a lot through different incidents that we've had. So that's also something to strive for if it's possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have 72 counties and 11 federally recognized tribes. So far, I've only met with about 20 of them. But again, we're kind of trying to meet with them in regions so that we can, you know, make it more manageable. We've got 16 county region I'll be meeting with in a month or so, and I'll be going to the governor's conference on emergency management too, which I think that's another thing where you go to, it's a conference where all the emergency managers will be there. I'll try to meet as many people as I can and do a lot of listening.
Fantastic.
Great. That is all the questions we have currently. Jay, unless you have anything, I can move on here.
No, at this point, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've covered a lot of great, hopefully, takeaways for those on the panel listening this afternoon. So I will thank again both Lisa and Megan for sharing their case studies, and Dominic, I'll hand the webinar back to you. And thanks again to NARUC for putting this together.
And thank you for moderating.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please join us for additional webinars this month. You can get the information and sign up for them at www.naruc.org/CPI. We look forward to having you. Additionally, we do have the mini guide available to you on the pop-up of this webinar. If you go to handouts, you can see the PDF and download it right now if you wish to read it. That'll be all from us. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic.